Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. Today I would like to inaugurate a new book tag, and I'm calling it Reading Books About Reading Books. And what that means, what this tag means, is that I would like to share with you, and I hope you'll share with me and other booktubers, some books that you've read that address the joy and wonder of reading itself, the benefits of reading, the love of reading. And there are a lot of books about this. Lots of essays have been written about it. In fact, you can even go back to antiquity, the ancient world, and find people like Cicero talking about the wonders of reading. Now, of course, in the ancient world, reading was a very different experience than it is for us. But once you get into the modern age, once the printing press was invented, suddenly everyone's talking about how great it is to have a book and to read a book. Now, a couple of things I want to mention here. I'm not talking about literary criticism as such. That's a whole different field. The late Harold Bloom was one of the most famous literary critics of our time. Literary criticism deals with particular authors, particular literary methods and styles, and how they change over time, and how one poet can impact the next generation of poets. It's very meticulous, very careful, almost mechanical study of writing and the influence of writing. That's literary criticism. It's fascinating. I love it, but that's not what I'm talking about here. And I'm also not talking about self-help books, okay, that promise great wonders if you follow this particular recipe or follow these particular steps in life. I'm just talking about reading in general, the act of reading and its impact on our lives. I've noticed that there's a lot of talk these days about something called bibliotherapy, even in the field of science and psychology and psychiatry. There's been quite an uptick of interest in how the act of reading can have physical benefits. They can lower your blood pressure, relax tense muscles, take away some anxiety even briefly. A lot of psychologists are recommending reading to some of their patients who have certain emotional challenges. And again, not reading a particular book, not a self-help book or anything, just simply sitting down with a book for an extended period of time. And for some people, that could be, a half an hour, just reading. Usually works of fiction and literature is what was often prescribed here. They'll let the patient choose whatever he wants to read. And I think what's happening there is reading takes you outside of yourself for a while. It seems like a lot of the emotional difficulties that are being faced by many of us today have to do with this incredibly narcissistic attitude that's just has a strangle grip on our culture. We are obsessed with ourselves, and that obsession can lead to some pretty difficult views about life in general and even your own self-understanding. But when you're reading a book, after the first 15 minutes or so, that book has taken you outside of yourself. You've gone somewhere else. You're in someone else's head for a while. So then when you come back to obsessing about yourself, you've got this extra thing to look at. You've gained some perspective. And so as far as the psychological benefits of reading, I think that's what's happening there. The physical benefits, I'm not sure what the connection is, but there certainly seems to be one. I particularly am attracted to the idea of lowering blood pressure, or people with heart problems, people who deal with anxiety and muscle tension and all. This reading is a great antidote for that. It's not a panacea for everything, but it certainly couldn't hurt. As far as reading, the kind of reading that I think most of us do, aside from the obvious benefits, we just like reading. But there's something there that I think we often don't consider, or there's some deeper reason for it. We all have our preferences for the kind of books that we like to read. Some people read nonfiction, some people choose fiction, certain genres. We have certain amounts of time we like to dedicate to reading. Certain days we read more than other days. But I think we often don't really think about the deeper reasons for that. What is it that's attractive? Why do we do this? Why is there a booktube? Why are there bookstores? What about libraries? What's all that about? What's really happening there? And I think there's a lot of different explanations for this and a lot of different reasons for this. And there are a great many books that address this very thing. There are a lot of these books that deal with the joys of reading are written by authors. And they talk about, their earliest memories of being around books and what books meant to them, what it meant to them to have their dad take them to the library or have mom take them to the library, what it meant to be read to when they were little. They may have had an aunt or an uncle who had a library in their home, and the impact that had on them, the secret joys of books. And there are a lot of books like that, a lot of essays like that. I want to mention a few. Some of these I have read, some of these not. I haven't read quite yet. The first one I want to mention is The Pleasures of Reading. This one nails it quite well. All right. The subtitle there is 43 Writers on the Discovery of Reading and the Books That Inspired Them. And there's some big names here. The editor of this had contacted various writers and asked them to contribute short essays about the joys of reading. And among the names on this list, I think many of you would recognize Michael Foote, Brian Moore, Judith Kerr, Jan Morris, Philip Ziegler, Edna O'Brien, Jane Gardam. Then, of course, we've got, I saw her, Germaine Greer, Margaret Atwood, Tom Stoppard, and it goes on and on. Hermione Lee, Jeanette Winterson, Tom Wells. And what's also interesting about this is the editor of this book is none other than Antonia Fraser, the British historian. So she knows a great deal about writing. Of course, she's an historian. Historians spend their time reading. What's that all about? I'm an historian myself. I could sit for hours with books. And of course, we're accumulating information and ideas and insight, but there's something else going on there too. And again, I think that differs from person to person. And so these essays kind of address that, the joys of reading. It's different for everybody. But also there's some commonalities too. I found this little book. I don't know who Anne Bogel is. I may be mispronouncing her name. She's got a popular blog called Modern Miss Darcy and a podcast, What Should I Read Next? But this it looks like a very charming little book called I'd Rather Be Reading, a sentiment that I think many of us could appreciate. I'd rather be reading The Delights and Dilemmas of the Reading Life, okay, by Anne Bogel. And then there's this book. I have not read this one, The Written Word. I think this is a fairly new release. This is an interesting book that deals essentially with the history of reading, the history of storytelling. The subtitle here is The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilization. And the author is Martin Puchner. Martin Puchner, okay? And I was thumbing through this. I'm going to get to this really soon. This is right up my alley. It begins in antiquity. I think it begins in antiquity. Yeah, in Mesopotamia, the ancient scrolls, and then it takes you through the Greeks and the Romans and into the Renaissance and into the modern age. About storytelling has played such an important role in human history. But then, of course, how are stories communicated? Originally orally, but eventually they get written down. And then you've got books, and how people are reading the stories. And this act of reading, again, is having a powerful impact on individuals, entire cultures, and entire civilizations. So, the written word, okay? Again, a book about reading. You'd be reading a book about reading if you read this. Also, Alan Jacobs, who's a teacher at Wheaton College. He's written 2 books that kind of touch upon what I'm getting at here. Breaking Bread with the Dead, A Reader's Guide to a More Tranquil Mind. It almost sounds like a self-help book, but it isn't. It's about the joys of reading in general and an encouragement to read more. And then Jacobs' other book, The Pleasure of Reading in an Age of Distraction. I've read both of these. One of the main themes he keeps coming back to again and again is how reading is kind of an antidote to, the age of distraction, to all the distractions around us, to social media, and these things that seem to grind us down and spit us out after a while. Reading is a personal act, and it's between you and the author of whatever it is you're reading. And no one needs to know what you're reading or even how much time you're reading. This is your thing. And you don't need to sign in. You don't need a password. There's no clicks. There's no advertisements that pop up. This is a very personal, contemplative act. And that term contemplative brings up another aspect of reading, and there are many books about the joys of reading as a spiritual exercise of sorts. I don't want to scare anybody away. I'm not going to get sectarian about this, but there's a book here. I've seen this on a lot of booktube channels. I know a lot of you have read this. Those of you who haven't, I recommend that you do. This book was written, I believe, the early 20th century, the late 19th century, by A.G. Sertalongus. I think I'm mispronouncing the name. It was originally written, it's called The Intellectual Life in Spirit, Conditions, and Methods. As I recall, I read this quite a long time ago. As I recall, it was originally written for students going on to a higher education, university level. And the book was meant to encourage them to read and to study and certain ideas of how to study and how to create thematic essays, kind of a handbook for students mostly in the liberal arts. But a big part of this book is just the joy and the importance of reading and the significance of reading and how important reading really is for one's development as a human being, one's completed full development. And from Sertalongus, we can go to C.S. Lewis, who also wrote a great deal about reading and its importance. And then from C.S. Lewis, we get more into our own time here. The Life of the Mind on the Joys and Travails of Thinking. You could substitute the word reading for that. And this is by James V. Schall. He wrote a number of books about the academic life, the intellectual life. In one way or another, all these books come back to the life of reading. And then, of course, this book here, The Classical Moment. Now, Sertalongus, C.S. Lewis, and Schall, they all have something in common. And when they talk about reading, they see reading as this spiritual kind of activity that one can engage in. Sertalongus and Schall, by the way, were both Catholic priests. C.S. Lewis was one of the most famous Christian apologists of the 20th century. Recently, there's been a book published called Reading for the Love of God by Jessica Wilson, who is a professor at Baylor University. She specializes in literature and the great books courses. And she touches on this too. She's a bit more open about it, but I haven't read her book yet, but what it says, the write-up about it on the back cover, on the dust cover, says, the simple act of reading as a spiritual practice can help us learn to pray well, love our neighbor, be contemplative, practice humility, disentangle ourselves from contemporary idols or contemporary distractions. I think this is a very interesting aspect here, and I hope I'm not scaring anybody away. Again, I don't want to get sectarian about this, but when you think about it, the three great monotheistic faiths that have such an influence on the world today, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And those three faiths are often referred to as religions of the book. In other words, if you are of any of those sects, there is at some point you're going to be reading a book. It might be the Torah, it might be the Bible, it might be the Quran, or the various commentaries about those books. Now, what those commentaries have to say, their analysis of the spiritual life is one thing, but reading those books is something else entirely different. I was thinking about this just the other day about how similar reading is to the experience of prayer. When you're reading a book, it's not just you and the book, it's you, the book, and the author. Now, you might never meet the author, you might never hear from the author. If you pass the author on the street, you might not recognize him or her. But while you're reading that book, you're having this intimate encounter with the author of the book. And I guess when you think about prayer, what's happening there? It's not just you and the prayer, it's you, the prayer, and whatever you believe God to be, right? You might never meet God, you might never hear from him, you could pass him on the street and not recognize him, but while you're praying, it's like while you're reading a book. You have that intimate connection with the author. While you're praying, you have that intimate connection with the God that you're praying to. That's interesting to me. That's fascinating to me. May not be particularly fascinating to you, but the spiritual part of it anyway. But the act of reading, there's so much going on there, and there's so much to be said about it. So this is my my new book tag, reading books about reading books. I'm going to include some prompts down below, and enjoy yourself. Take time with it. Think about it. I'd love to hear from you all. If you want to share a book that you've read, I've got a book that I'm going to post on very, very, very soon about an author. He's certainly an author, and at one point in his life, when he was in his 20s, he underwent some very stressful events in 1 year of his life. ill health and a death in the family and all of this. And something that kind of pulled him through that was his love of reading and how he made sure to set aside a certain amount of time every day to read, and how that helped him get through a very difficult year in his life. I'll put up a post on that very soon. In the meantime, take a look at the prompts, give it some thought. And if you do, thank you for your time and consideration. And that's what I've got for you today. So take care of yourselves and never, ever stop reading.